The cold came before the light. It moved across the parking lot the way it always did in late November in Billings, Montana, low and flat, and without apology, sliding under doors and through cracked weather stripping and into the bones of anyone foolish enough to sleep somewhere other than indoors. The sky above was the color of old concrete, not dark, not light, just the hard, formless gray that settles over the northern plains like a lid pressed down on the world. Inside the cab of a 2009 Ford F-15. Oh, a man stirred. He did not wake the way most people wake. There was no slow drift upward from sleep, no comfortable stretch or lazy blinking at the ceiling. Garrett Cole came awake the way he always came awake, instantly and completely eyes open, body still scanning the inside of the truck before he had taken his second breath. Old habit, the kind that gets trained into a man and never fully leaves no matter how many years pass or how far he gets from the place where it was necessary. He was 38 years old. He looked older. His face carried the kind of weathering that comes not just from time, but from sustained exposure to hard conditions, wind and sun, and long nights in places where relaxing your attention could end your life. His jaw was square and stubbled 3 or 4 days past a proper shave. A narrow scar ran from the outer corner of his right eyebrow toward his temple, pale and slightly raised, the kind of mark that a field dressing leaves when the wound beneath it closes without the benefit of a proper medical facility. His hair was dark brown, cut short and practical in the way military men cut their hair not for appearance, but because short hair is one less thing to worry about. His eyes were pale blue, and they were always moving. Even now in the silent cab of a parked truck in an empty supermarket parking lot at 6 in the morning, his eyes moved across the space with the quiet efficiency of a man who had spent most of his adult life working in environments where stillness could be a trick and safety was never assumed. 14 years. That was how long Garrett had served. Navy Special Operations support attached to units that worked in places most Americans could not have located on a map without assistance. Coastlines where the air tasted of salt and diesel. Desert towns where the heat shimmered off the ground in waves that made everything at a distance look like a mirage. Warrow mountain passes in the dark, where the only sounds were boots on loose rock and the low crackle of a radio. He had done his job in all of those places. He had done it well. He had brought every man in his unit home from every mission he had been part of, right up until the last one. The last one had not gone the same way. A roadside device, a secondary detonation. The kind of event that takes less than 2 seconds to happen and changes the shape of everything that comes after. Garrett had survived. 3 of the men near him had not. And the version of Garrett Cole that had walked onto that road was not the same version that was eventually loaded into a medical transport vehicle and taken away from it. He did not think about that now. He had learned through a long and difficult process that the hours immediately after waking were not the right time to let those memories move through him freely. The mornings were for practical things, assessment, forward motion. Get through the next hour before you think about anything else. He turned his head. Rex was already awake. The dog sat upright in the passenger seat, his large body perfectly still, his amber eyes fixed on Garrett with the focused patience of an animal that had been bred and trained for exactly this, the quiet work of watching, waiting, and being present for a person who needed it. Rex was a German shepherd, 6 years old, nearly 90 pounds of thick black and tan fur and disciplined muscle. His ears stood straight up. His muzzle was broad and black and slightly grayed at the edges. A thin scar ran along the left side of his face, mostly hidden by his coat, a remnant of his own service before Garrett had adopted him in the final months of his last deployment. They had both come home carrying things they had not been sent out with. Rex did not bark. He did not whine or pace or paw at the door. He simply sat and looked at Garrett with those steady, serious eyes and communicated through that look everything he needed to communicate. I am here. You are here. That is enough. Now let's begin. Garrett reached across and put one hand on the dog's broad head. "Morning," he said. His voice was low and rough from sleep and from the cold air inside the cab. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. He straightened up in the driver's seat and took stock. Outside the parking lot was mostly empty. A delivery truck idled at the far end near the loading dock. The supermarket would not open for another 2 hours. The street beyond the lot was quiet, a single set of headlights moving through the intersection in the gray morning light. He checked his phone. No calls, no messages, no emails with subject lines beginning with the phrase, "We are pleased to offer." 3 weeks since the last application. A warehouse receiving position, a night security role, a delivery route job for a regional freight company, a maintenance position at a school district 40 miles north of town. He had applied for all four in the same week, had followed up on each of them, had worn the best shirt he owned to the one interview that had materialized, and had sat across from a young HR coordinator who had looked at his resume with the expression of someone encountering an object they could not quite categorize. She had thanked him for his service. She had told him they would be in touch. That had been 17 days ago. Garrett looked at the gas gauge. The needle sat just above the line that indicated empty. Not on the line, just above it, which meant he had perhaps 20 miles of range, 30 if he drove carefully and did not run the heater. He opened his banking app. $36.42. He closed the app. Rex nudged his arm. "I know," Garrett said. He got out of the truck. The cold hit him the moment he opened the door, a flat, aggressive cold that pushed through his jacket and immediately found every place where the fabric had worn thin. He zipped the collar up to his throat and walked Rex across the empty lot to a narrow strip of frozen grass along the sidewalk at the far edge of the property. The dog moved with calm precision, methodical in the way he approached everything, his nose working along the ground as he navigated his morning routine. Even here, even in a supermarket parking lot in Billings at 6 in the morning, Rex moved with the quiet competence of a working animal, present, deliberate, unhurried. They walked back to the truck. Garrett made a decision that he made 3 or 4 mornings a week, a decision that was simultaneously practical and necessary and quietly painful because it required him to spend money he did not have in a place where someone knew his name and would look him in the eye without making him feel like a problem waiting to be sorted out. He drove to Vera's. The diner sat on a corner 2 miles from the parking lot, a low building with a lit sign above the door and a row of windows along the front that fogged with warmth in the cold mornings. Inside, it smelled of fried bacon and coffee and something sweet that was probably the pie Vera made on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. The booths along the window were upholstered in dark red vinyl cracked along the seams from years of use. The floor was white linoleum, worn to a soft gray in the paths between the counter and the tables. Vera Hutchins was already behind the counter when Garrett came in. She was in her early 40s, tall and slightly angular, with sandy blonde hair pulled back from her face in a practical way that suggested she had neither time nor particular interest in making it look like anything other than what it was. Her skin was fair and lightly freckled, the kind of complexion common to women who had grown up in the northern states and spent most of their lives indoors, except by choice. She had the eyes of someone who had spent many years paying attention to people, registering small things the way a person held a coffee cup, the way they looked at the door when they came in, and drawing quiet, accurate conclusions from what they saw. She looked up when Garrett came in. "Seat yourself," she said. He took the same booth he always took, the one near the back, where he could see both the front door and the counter without turning his head. Rex settled under the table without instruction, his body folding into the narrow space with practiced ease. Vera came over without a menu. She set a coffee in front of him, heavy ceramic mug filled to within a half-inch of the top, and looked down at Rex for a moment with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was somewhere in the territory of one. "How's he doing?" she said. It was not entirely a question. "Good," Garrett said. She nodded once as if this answer confirmed something she had already decided and walked back toward the counter. Garrett wrapped both hands around the mug. The heat moved through his palms and up through his wrists, and he sat with it for a moment before he drank. The coffee was strong and bitter and exactly what he needed. Outside the window, the street was beginning to come alive in small increments. A car passing a woman walking a dog on the opposite sidewalk. A bus moving slowly through the intersection with two passengers visible through the fogged windows. Vera came back after a few minutes with a plate she set on the table without ceremony. Eggs, two slices of toast, a small pile of hash browns that were browned properly on both sides. No discussion of whether he had ordered it. He came in enough mornings that the ordering had become unnecessary. She refilled his coffee from the pot she carried and looked at him with the steady, unsentimental directness that Garrett had come to understand was just how she communicated. "Anything come back," she said. "No," he said. She absorbed this without comment. She was not the kind of woman who fills silences with reassurance, and Garrett had come to appreciate that more than he would have been able to explain. Reassurance from strangers in his experience was almost always a form of discomfort management, something people offered to make themselves feel better about witnessing a situation they could not fix. Vera simply acknowledged what was happening and moved on, which felt more like respect than any amount of sympathetic nodding would have. She went back to the counter. Rex's nose appeared briefly above the edge of the table. "Not for you," Garrett said. The nose disappeared. He ate slowly. He had learned to eat slowly when he did not know exactly when he would eat again. Outside, the morning continued its gradual arrival. He watched the street. He thought about the gas gauge. He calculated for the fourth or fifth time that week the specific sequence of decisions that had brought him to a parking lot in Billings with $36 in a dog in a truck that needed an oil change he could not afford. The calculation always arrived at the same conclusion: not a single failure, not a single bad decision, but an accumulation of circumstances and systems that were not built for the kind of man he had become after 14 years of the kind of service he had given. The military had made him precise. It had made him reliable. It had made him capable of functioning in conditions that would break most people. It had also made him difficult to explain on a standard employment form. The skills that kept men alive in hostile environments did not translate cleanly into bullet points that a hiring manager could understand, and the invisible damage that came with certain kinds of service could not be disclosed without consequences that he was not willing to accept. He was not looking for sympathy, he was looking for work. There was a difference, and the distinction mattered to him in a way that was difficult to articulate, but constant. His phone buzzed. He looked at it, unknown number, Montana area code, but a prefix he did not recognize. He watched it ring for a moment, an old habit, the brief pause of assessment before committing to action, and then he answered. "Cole," he said. A man's voice came back measured and unhurried. "Am I speaking with Garrett Cole, formerly of the United States Navy?" Garrett set down his coffee. "Who's calling?" "My name is Arthur Wells. I'm an attorney with Wells and Associates based in Kansas City. I apologize for reaching out this early, Mr. Cole. I want to assure you this is a legitimate call." Garrett said nothing. He waited. "I'm reaching out," the voice continued, "because you've been named as the sole beneficiary in a will filed in this jurisdiction. The estate in question belongs to a man named Raymond Holt." The name landed without any sense of recognition. Garrett turned it over in his mind the way you might turn over an unfamiliar object, looking for some angle from which it made sense. "I don't know anyone by that name," he said. "I understand," the lawyer said. "I'd ask you to bear with me for a moment. This is the kind of call that tends to make more sense in person than over the phone." Rex had come out from under the table and was sitting beside the booth now, his ears angled forward, watching Garrett's face. "What kind of estate?" Garrett said. "A working farm," the lawyer said. "Agricultural land equipment structures. Western Kansas. Several hundred acres." The diner was quiet. Vera was behind the counter with her back turned, wiping down the coffee machine. Outside, a truck rolled through the intersection. The light through the window had shifted slightly, going from gray to a thin pale gold, as the sun began to clear the horizon. Garrett looked at Rex. Rex looked back at him. "Mr. Cole," the lawyer said, "I know this is a great deal to receive over the phone. I'd like to suggest a meeting at your earliest convenience. I can arrange travel reimbursement if—" "I'll drive," Garrett said. He drove 2 days. Kansas City in November was not warm, but it was warmer than Billings, and the cold there had a different quality to it, less aggressive, more resigned, the cold of a place that accepted winter without making it personal. Garrett arrived in the early afternoon of the second day and parked the truck in the structure adjacent to the building the lawyer had described. He sat for a moment before getting out the engine ticking as it cooled. Rex sitting upright in the passenger seat, watching the concrete pillars of the parking structure with the attentive calm of an animal that has learned to take new environments at face value. "This is either the most important thing that's happened in 3 years," Garrett said, "or it's nothing." Rex did not offer an opinion. "Yeah," Garrett said. He got out. The building was brick 12 floors, the kind of professional structure that had been built with the intention of communicating stability and reliability to the people who entered it. The lobby was carpeted in a dark pattern, the walls paneled in something that was either wood or a very good imitation of it. A directory near the elevator listed Wells and Associates on the 11th floor. Garrett took Rex up in the elevator. The receptionist at the front desk looked at the ball and then at Garrett and then at the dog again and said that Mr. Wells had been expecting him and would he please follow her. Arthur Wells was already standing when they came in. He was in his early 60s, lean in the way that some men become lean with age, not frail but reduced to something more essential, the surplus removed by time. His hair was silver and neatly arranged. He wore a dark suit that fit him well, and a tie that was burgundy and conservative. His glasses were thin-framed and sat low on his nose, and his eyes above them were gray and calm, and gave the impression of a man who had spent decades in rooms where difficult things were said and had learned how to be steady in the presence of all of them. He extended his hand. Garrett shook it. "Thank you for making the trip, Mr. Cole." He looked down at Rex. "And your partner?" "He goes where I go," Garrett said. "Of course." Wells gestured to the chair across his desk. "Please." Garrett sat. Rex settled on the floor beside him, his body angled slightly toward the door out of habit. Wells sat down and opened a folder on the desk in front of him. He did not rush. He arranged the papers with deliberate care, the way a man handles something that he understands requires proper handling. Then he reached into the folder and removed a photograph and placed it on the desk between them, turning it so that Garrett could see it clearly. An older man, broad through the chest and shoulders, the build of someone who had worked physically for most of his life. Faded denim overalls. A wide-brimmed work hat casting a shadow across a face that was deeply lined, sun-darkened, framed by a gray mustache. He was standing at the edge of a wheat field, and the field behind him stretched away in both directions for what looked like a very long distance. He was not smiling exactly, but there was something in his expression that suggested he had stood in that spot many times and felt each time some version of the same quiet satisfaction. Garrett looked at the photograph. There was nothing in his memory that connected to it. "I don't know him, he said. "I know," Wells said. He did not seem surprised. He turned to the next document in the folder and slid it across the desk. "I want to show you something." It was a printout of a military record. Garrett recognized the format immediately. He had seen enough of them, had been part of enough of them, and his eyes moved automatically to the heading. Location: Northern Syria. Date: March 2017. Something shifted behind his sternum. Not a memory exactly, not yet. More like the first pressure of something that has been held below the surface beginning to move upward, slow and heavy. Wells spoke carefully. Raymond Holt was working in the region at the time. He was an agricultural engineer, part of a humanitarian program helping rebuild irrigation infrastructure in rural communities following years of conflict. He was traveling with a civilian convoy when the convoy was attacked. The pressure increased. Garrett did not speak. "Your unit was dispatched to extract the survivors," Wells said. According to the report, the operation lasted approximately 4 minutes. And then it was there, not in pieces. All at once, the way those memories always came when they came complete and immediate, arriving not gradually but in a single unfolding, the way a door blows open in a strong wind rather than swinging slowly on its hinges. The smoke first, thick and chemical smelling, billowing across a road that had been clear 5 minutes earlier. The sound of small arms fire close, and then closer. The civilians crouched behind the remains of two vehicles. The lead truck stopped at an angle where the road curved between concrete walls on both sides. His team moving through the smoke and a wedge Garrett on the right calling out, gesturing move now, as the civilians began to come forward one by one. And then the older man, broad-shouldered, hat knocked sideways, a gash on his forearm that had soaked through his sleeve and was dripping steadily from his wrist. He was not moving toward the extraction point. He was standing over another man, one of the convoy's local workers, who had been hit and was conscious but unable to stand on his own. The old American was trying to get the man upright, trying to get him moving, not willing to go until the other man went. 3 minutes into the operation, the gunfire was tightening, the window was closing. Garrett had crossed the gap between them, put his hand on the old man's arm, and said something he could not now remember exactly what. And the old man had looked at him with an expression that was not fear, but something else entirely. Not stubbornness either, just the absolute clarity of a person who had already decided what kind of man he was going to be in this moment and was not going to let circumstances renegotiate that decision. Together, they got the injured worker into the transport. Then Garrett pushed the old man in after him. And then the vehicle was moving and the door was closing and the smoke closed around the road behind them. 4 minutes. He had not learned the man's name. He had not thought of him again. Garrett sat in the chair across from Arthur Wells and looked at the photograph and understood with a slow, deep certainty that the man looking back at him from the edge of that Kansas wheat field was the man he had put in that vehicle 8 years ago and never seen again. That was him, Garrett said. His voice was level, even. The kind of level and even that requires some effort to maintain. Yeah, Wells said quietly. I never got his name. He got yours. Garrett looked up. Wells removed a second document from the folder. It was not a legal form. It was a handwritten letter, 3 pages, the handwriting firm in the early pages and somewhat looser in the final one, the kind of looseness that comes from age or illness or both. Wells placed it on the desk and did not speak for a moment, allowing the silence to be what it was. Mr. Holt's instructions were that this be given to you directly, Wells said. He wrote it himself, about 14 months ago. Garrett looked at the letter but did not touch it yet. He spent several months after returning from Syria trying to locate the unit that extracted the convoy. Wells continued. It took time. Military records of that nature are not always accessible to the public. But he was persistent, and eventually he found the name of the operator who had pulled him into the vehicle. He tracked me down, Garrett said. He confirmed your identity, Wells said carefully. He chose not to contact you. His reasoning, which he explains in the letter, was that men who have served in those environments deserve the opportunity to move forward without strangers reappearing and reopening things that may need to stay closed. Garrett said nothing. However, Wells continued, his voice remaining steady and measured. He did not stop paying attention. He let that settle. Then, over the following years, Mr. Holt made efforts to track your general circumstances, not in an intrusive manner. Simply, he wanted to know you were all right. When it became clear that you were experiencing significant difficulty after leaving the service, he made a decision. Garrett picked up the letter. The handwriting on the first page was deliberate and clear. The man had taken his time with it. He had not written quickly or carelessly. Mr. Cole, I will not insult you by pretending that what I'm leaving you is simple or that you'll know what to do with it immediately. I didn't know what to do with it for the first 20 years I owned it. What I will tell you is that it is real and it is yours if you choose to take it, and I have thought carefully about whether you are the right man to receive it. I have concluded that you are. Garrett read slowly. Raymond Holt had been a careful writer. He did not use more words than he needed. He explained the farm, its size, its history, the irrigation project he had been building, the specific qualities of the land that made it worth caring about. He explained his own circumstances, the decline of his health over the past 2 years, the absence of family who might have claimed what he was leaving behind. He wrote about the farm the way a man writes about something he has loved for a long time, not sentimentally, but with the honest precision of real knowledge. And then near the end of the second page, the letter changed. I know you are living out of your vehicle. Garrett stopped reading. He sat with those words for a moment. I know things have not gone the way they should have gone for a man who gave what you gave. I want to be direct with you about something because I believe you are the kind of man who prefers directness to comfort. I did not wait until now by accident. I could have contacted you 2 years ago or three. I could have offered you money or assistance or any number of things that might have made the immediate situation easier. I chose not to. I want you to understand why. A man who is given something when he is comfortable may not need it. A man who is given something when he is at the end of what he can manage alone is the man who will understand what it is worth. I am not saying this to be cruel. I am saying it because I have spent my life working land, and I understand that a seed planted in poor conditions very often does not take. But a seed planted when the conditions are right, when the ground has been broken open and is ready to receive something, that seed has a chance. You are at the right moment, Mr. Cole. The ground is ready. This farm is not a gift. It is a responsibility. I had plans for it that I did not finish. I am trusting you to finish them. That is not a small thing. I know it. I am trusting you with it anyway. Raymond Holt Garrett set the letter down. The office was quiet. Through the tall windows behind Wells's desk, the afternoon light lay flat and golden across the rooftops of the city. Rex had moved from his position beside the chair and was now sitting with his shoulder against Garrett's leg, his weight a steady, warm pressure. Wells did not speak. He understood in the way that experienced attorneys understand that there are moments in which speaking is not helpful. Garrett looked at the photograph again, the old man at the edge of his field, the mustache and the hat and the lines in his face that came from decades of work and sun and paying attention to the land. The expression that was not quite a smile, but was something in that direction. A man standing on ground he knew completely that he had spent his life learning that he had not been able to finish what he wanted to do with. I had plans for it that I did not finish. I am trusting you to finish them. Garrett had not been trusted with anything in 2 years. He had not trusted himself with very much either. What happens now, he said. His voice was the same as it had been when he walked in level quiet, giving nothing away. But something behind it had shifted. Something that had been arranged in one configuration was beginning to settle into another. If you accept the inheritance, Wells said, the property transfers to you as of today. There are some administrative matters. Paperwork. The tax situation will need to be addressed. There is a past due amount that came due in Raymond's final year. But the land is clear. The house is livable. The equipment is old, but it's there. Tax situation, Garrett said. It's manageable, Wells said. Difficult, but manageable if you are willing to work. Garrett almost said something about the irony of that word about the past 17 days of applications and silences and closed doors. He didn't. I need the paperwork, he said. Of course. Wells began to organize the documents. Garrett looked out the window. Somewhere west of where he was sitting, there was a piece of ground with his name on it. Several hundred acres of Kansas land with an unfinished irrigation system and a tax bill, in a barn that probably needed attention, in a house where an old man had lived alone until he couldn't anymore, writing careful letters to a soldier he had met once for 4 minutes in the smoke of a Syrian road. Rex looked up at him. His amber eyes were steady and warm and completely certain in the way that dogs are certain about things that matter, about presence and loyalty, and the simple fact that whatever came next, they would face it from the same position they had always held together, side by side, moving forward. Garrett reached down and put his hand on the dog's head. "All right," he said quietly. Not to the lawyer, not to the room, to himself, and to the old man in the photograph. "All right." The sun was already lower by the time he walked back out to the parking structure, the paperwork in a folder under his arm, Rex walking at his left side in the precise, unhurried way he always walked. The truck waited where he had left it, dusty and battered and absolutely reliable in the way that old, well-built things often are when everything else has fallen apart around them. Garrett opened the passenger door. Rex jumped in, settled into the seat, looked straight ahead through the windshield. Garrett got in, put the folder on the back seat, and sat for a moment in the silence of the cab. He thought about $36. He thought about 4 job applications in 17 days of silence. He thought about a parking lot in Billings and cold mornings, and a coffee he couldn't always afford, and a woman who refilled it anyway without making it a statement. Then he thought about a wheat field stretching to the horizon, and an old man standing at its edge looking out over something he had spent his life building, and a single sentence written in a hand that had grown less steady with the passing years. "I am trusting him to keep mine." He started the truck. He pulled out of the parking structure into the afternoon light, turned west, and drove. The farm appeared on the 3rd day of December around 2 in the afternoon, when the light was already beginning to drop toward the horizon and the Kansas sky had gone the color of old brass. Garrett had been driving the county road for nearly 20 minutes, following the directions Arthur Wells had written on a note card in the neat, deliberate hand of a man who did not trust GPS in rural areas. The land on both sides of the road was flat and wide, and largely empty harvested fields that had been turned over for winter, their dark soil sitting bare and open, broken occasionally by windbreaks of bare-limbed cottonwood that stood along the fence lines like men waiting for something. The road itself was gravel single lane in places, and the truck moved over it slowly, the tires throwing a thin trail of pale dust that the wind immediately pulled apart and scattered. Rex sat upright in the passenger seat. His ears were forward. His nose was working at the gap in the window Garrett had cracked 2 inches to give him air, reading whatever the cold Kansas wind was carrying across those open fields. Dry soil, distant crops, the particular mineral smell of land that had been worked for a very long time by people who understood what they were doing. Garrett slowed the truck. Through the windshield past a wooden fence post that had leaned at a slight angle for what looked like many years, he could see it. The Harper farm. The Holt farm, now he supposed, though. The sign near the entry road still read the name of whoever had owned it before. Raymond faded to near illegibility, spread across several hundred acres of western Kansas land, with the quiet, unhurried presence of something that had been exactly where it was for a very long time and had no intention of being anywhere else. The fields rolled outward from the central structures in wide, irregular squares, some of them dark with turned soil, others still carrying the pale, dry remnants of the most recent harvest season. A line of metal irrigation pipe ran along the near edge of the largest field, following the fence line, until it reached a junction point where the pipe stopped its open end, capped with a plastic fitting the line, simply ending in the middle of the field like a sentence that had run out of space. The farmhouse stood at the center of the property. It was a 2-story wooden structure, white painted, the paint faded and peeling in the way that paint fades and peels in environments where the sun is strong and the wind never entirely stops. A covered porch wrapped around the front and the south side, and 2 wooden rocking chairs sat on it, their positions suggesting they had not been moved in some time, but had not been placed there carelessly either. They faced west toward the direction from which the afternoon light came, and from which, on clear evenings, the sun would set over a long, unobstructed view of flat land, going all the way to the edge of what the eye could reach. Raymond Holt had sat in one of those chairs. Garrett did not know which one. He pulled the truck to a stop near the front of the house and sat for a moment with the engine idling. Rex looked at him. "Yeah," Garrett said. He got out. The cold was different here than it had been in Montana. Less aggressive, more patient. The wind moved across the open land with a low, steady sound, not the sharp gusting of the mountain-adjacent plains to the north, but something more consistent, more committed, the kind of wind that does not come and go, but simply is a permanent condition of the landscape that everything living in it has long since adapted to. The air smelled of dry earth and distance, and underneath both of those, something faintly organic that Garrett could not immediately identify, but that would later learn was the smell of soil that had been properly cared for. Rex jumped down from the truck and immediately put his nose to the ground. He worked in a widening circle from the truck's front bumper, methodical and unhurried, cataloging the unfamiliar territory the way he cataloged everything completely, without skipping anything, taking the time required to understand what he was dealing with before committing to a direction. Garrett walked to the porch. The boards did not creak as badly as he had expected. They were old but solid, the kind of construction that used lumber of a quality that is difficult to find anymore, the kind of boards that were cut from timber that had grown for long enough to develop real density. The front door was unlocked. Arthur Wells had told him it would be, and Garrett opened it and stepped inside. The interior of the house was dim and cold, and smelled of cedar and old paper, and something faint underneath those things that might have been pipe tobacco, though it had been years since anyone had smoked in this room. The floor was wide plank, hardwood, dark with age, solid underfoot. The walls of the entry and the front room were lined with photographs, black and white images of earlier decades, color photographs from more recent years, all of them showing the land in various states of season and development, fields of wheat at various heights, machinery in different eras. And in many of them, Mayman Holt himself aging backward. The further along the wall you looked, a broad-shouldered young man in the older images, then a middle-aged man with a mustache beginning to show gray, then finally the man in the photograph on Arthur Wells's desk, older and more weathered, but still carrying himself with the particular uprightness of a person who considers posture a reflection of character. In none of the photographs was anyone else. Raymond Holt had lived alone for a long time. Garrett walked through the front room and into the kitchen. The surfaces were clean. The dishes were organized in the cabinets in careful stacks. On the counter near the window, a set of mason jars held dried herbs labeled in small, neat handwriting. In the drawer nearest the door, Garrett found what Wells had warned him he would find: a white envelope, his name written on it in the same handwriting as the letter in Kansas City, though shakier here, the letters slightly uneven in a way they had not been in the earlier correspondence. On the back of the envelope, a single word: later. Garrett set it on the counter. In the same drawer beneath a collection of rubber-banded receipts and a folded road map of western Kansas was a county tax notice. Past due. He unfolded it and looked at the number at the bottom. It was not an impossible number, but it required money he did not currently have, and the due date was 62 days away. He put it back in the drawer, closed the drawer, and went back outside to find Rex. The barn stood 200 feet east of the house, a large red structure with metal roofing and wooden walls built from timbers that looked original to the property, hand-hewn thick, darkened with decades of weather. Garrett walked around its perimeter before going in, looking at the foundation and the wall construction and the condition of the lower boards with the methodical attention of a man assessing a position. The walls were sound. The foundation was solid concrete poured in an era when concrete was mixed to last. But along the upper section of the south face, a section of metal roofing had been improperly patched. The repair material did not match the original, and the seam between the two was visible even from the ground. Inside, the barn smelled of old hay and engine oil and dry wood. The floor was packed earth hard and smooth from decades of use. Along the north wall, 3 pieces of agricultural equipment sat in a row: a mid-sized tractor, an older grain drill, and a piece of machinery Garrett could not immediately identify. He walked to the tractor first, climbed up, looked at the controls, got back down and opened the engine cover. He was not a mechanic. He had some understanding of engines, military vehicles, generators, the basic mechanical systems that a man learns to maintain in environments where calling a technician is not an option. But a tractor engine of this size and age was a different body of knowledge, and he was honest enough with himself to recognize the limits of what he was looking at. The battery was dead. That much was obvious. Whether there was more wrong underneath that, he could not tell. He lowered the hood. Rex was standing near the far corner of the barn, his nose pointed at a section of the wall near the floor. Garrett walked over. A wooden door, narrow and low, set into the wall with hinges that had rusted orange. Garrett worked the latch and pulled it open. A storage room, small, perhaps 10 feet by 12. The shelves along the walls were lined with sealed containers of various sizes, most of them labeled in the same neat hand as the jars in the kitchen. Seed, wheat variety and planting, date noted. Soybeans, 2 varieties. Corn, each container sealed properly, each one positioned with careful deliberateness, the labels outward and legible. On the lower shelves, folded burlap sacks, coils of drip irrigation tubing, boxes of fittings and connectors. Raymond Holt had been preparing for seasons he would not live to plant. Garrett stood in the storage room for a long moment. Rex sat in the doorway and watched him. He had plans, Garrett said quietly. Rex said nothing. Yeah, Garrett said. He was on the back half of the property walking the line of the irrigation system in the fading afternoon light when he heard the truck. It came up the county road slowly, an older blue pickup that had seen better decades, and it turned into the property without hesitation, as if the driver had made this turn many times before. It stopped near the barn. A man got out. He was in his mid-50s, broad through the chest and shoulders, with forearms that showed even through his jacket sleeves the particular density of muscle that develops over decades of physical labor. His face was weathered and sun-darkened, framed by a heavy brown beard that was going gray at the edges and along the jaw. He wore a flannel shirt under a canvas work jacket and denim jeans that were not new. His boots were the kind that had been resoled at least once. He walked toward Garrett without hurrying, without particular ceremony, the way a man walks toward another man on a piece of ground they both have reason to be standing on. He stopped about 6 feet away. Jack Briggs, he said. He did not extend his hand immediately. He looked at Garrett with the direct, appraising attention of someone who has learned to read character quickly and does not particularly care if that process is visible. Garrett Cole. Briggs looked at Rex, who had positioned himself slightly to Garrett's left and was watching the new arrival with alert but unagitated eyes. Hell of a dog, Briggs said. He thinks so too. Something shifted slightly in Briggs's expression, not quite a smile, but the edge of one. He looked out across the property, his gaze moving across the fields, with the practiced ease of a man reading a landscape he knew well. Fence between your south field and my east pasture needs work, he said. 2 posts heaved from the frost last spring. Raymond was going to get to it in the fall. He paused. He didn't. I'll look at it, Garrett said. Briggs looked at him again. You farmed before? No. Briggs took this in without visible reaction. Military, he said. It was not a question. Navy, 14 years. Briggs nodded once slowly, the way men nod when information confirms a conclusion they had already arrived at from other evidence. He looked at the irrigation line running along the edge of the near field. Raymond was in the middle of extending the water system to the south fields when his health went sideways, he said. The main line runs from the pump house behind the barn. He got the pipe laid about 60% of the way. The connections on the east branch are complete. The west branch and the south terminal are not. He paused. Without water reaching the south terminal, you can't grow anything in those 40 acres down there. It's the best ground on the property. Garrett looked south across the fields. In the dying afternoon light, the land was the color of rust and shadow. Can it be done, he said. Most of it. Briggs reached into his jacket pocket and produced a folded piece of paper, a hand-drawn diagram of the irrigation layout, the lines rendered in pencil with notes in small handwriting that Garrett recognized as Raymond Holt's. He left me a copy of this, said I might need it eventually. Briggs held it out. Figured you might need it more. Garrett took the paper, he unfolded it, and looked at the diagram. The network was more complex than he had understood from walking the surface lines, multiple branches, junction points, pressure regulators placed at specific intervals. I'll need to learn the system, Garrett said. I can walk you through what I know, Briggs said. Not warmly, but not reluctantly either. The tone of a man who has a practical reason to be helpful to shared fence and is being straightforward about it. They stood in the cold for a moment. Then Briggs said without particular inflection, I made Raymond an offer on this place 18 months ago when he started getting bad. He looked at Garrett without accusation, but without softening it either. He turned me down. I didn't know why at the time. Garrett waited. I know why now, Briggs said. Wells called me last month. Professional courtesy, I suppose. Told me Raymond had made other arrangements. He paused. I'm not telling you this to cause trouble. I'm telling you because I'd rather you know it directly than hear it some other way and wonder what I'm thinking. What are you thinking? Garrett said. Briggs looked at him steadily. I'm thinking Raymond Holt had better judgment than most people gave him credit for, and I'm willing to wait and see if he was right this time. He picked up his truck keys from his jacket pocket. The fence posts. Come by Saturday morning if you want to deal with them together. My place is half a mile up the county road, mailbox, says Briggs. He walked back to his truck. Garrett watched him go. Rex sat beside him and watched too. He was going to buy this place, Garrett said. Rex flicked his ears, and he still showed up with that diagram. Rex looked up at him. Yeah, Garrett said. I noticed that too. That night the storm came. It built from the northwest across the open plains with the particular speed that flat land allows no hills to slow it, no terrain to break it apart, nothing between the weather and the farm except 40 miles of empty ground. By 9 in the evening, the wind had picked up to a sustained howl that pressed against the walls of the farmhouse with a physical insistence, finding every gap in the window frames, rattling the porch boards, moving through the eaves with a sound that was somewhere between a moan and a whistle. By midnight, the rain had arrived. Not ordinary rain, the kind of rain that comes with a system that has been building pressure across hundreds of miles and finally releases it all at once, sheets of it coming in nearly horizontally against the south face of the house, hammering the windows with a sound like gravel thrown against glass. The temperature had dropped sharply with the front's passage, and what came down was cold enough to be half frozen, clicking against the windows in the way that sleet clicks. Garrett was in the kitchen when he heard it. A metallic sound from the direction of the barn, not the ordinary rattling of the storm, but something larger, a deep, resonant crash that carried even through the noise of the rain and the wind. Rex was on his feet before the sound finished, body-stiff ears forward. Garrett pulled on his jacket and boots. They went out into it. The rain hit like something solid. Within 20 steps, he was soaked through the jacket, the cold reaching his shirt and then his skin, and he moved toward the barn with his head down and one arm raised against the wind. Rex ran ahead, his dark form barely visible in the darkness, moving with the absolute sureness of an animal that does not let weather compromise its navigation. The sound had come from the upper section of the south wall. The patch roofing section, the one Garrett had noticed on his inspection that first afternoon, had partially separated. A 4-foot section of metal paneling had torn loose from its fastening at the upper edge and was now acting as a lever in the wind, a piece of metal large enough to cause serious damage, swinging and slamming against the wooden framing beneath it with every gust. Water was pouring through the wall in a steady stream, running down the inside wall and spreading across the packed earth floor. Garrett got into the barn and found the ladder. What followed was an hour of work that he would not fully remember in its details afterward, working in the dark with a headlamp and whatever material he could find in the barn's storage using ropes and boards, and a staple gun he found in a toolbox near the tractor to secure the loose panel against the framing well enough to hold until morning. The rain came through the gap even as he worked, soaking him to the skin. The wind made every step on the ladder a negotiation. Rex stayed below, watching, occasionally shifting position when something fell or the ladder moved, always tracking Garrett within those steady amber eyes. By midnight 30, the panel was secured. Not properly, not permanently, but held. Garrett climbed down and stood in the barn and let his breathing slow. His hands were shaking from cold, not from the work. He was soaked entirely through. The headlamp threw a small yellow circle of light in the large dark interior of the barn, and in that circle he could see Rex sitting 3 feet away, watching him with the expression that meant, "You are all right." This was manageable. "Now breathe." "Yeah," Garrett said, "I'm breathing." Rex shook the rain out of his coat, sending a spray of cold water across Garrett's legs. "Great," Garrett said. In the early morning before the light had fully returned, Rex found the valve. Garrett had been walking the irrigation line on the east side of the property, checking for storm damage, when Rex stopped moving ahead of him and stood still with his nose pointed at the ground near a junction fitting. Not digging, not barking, just stopped and pointed, which was the behavior that meant he had located something that needed to be looked at. The fitting had shifted. A section of the main line ran through a slight depression in the ground at this junction, and the storm had moved enough soil that the coupling had twisted perhaps 15 degrees from its proper alignment. The seal was still holding, but barely a thin seam of wet ground around the fitting indicated that water had been slowly escaping under pressure. A few more hours and the seal would have failed entirely. With a section of the main line open, the entire irrigation system would have lost pressure. The pump would have run dry. The pump motor running dry, under load would have burned within hours. Garrett got a wrench from the toolbox and aligned the fitting. He tightened it down and checked the ground around it. The seeping stopped. He stood up and looked at Rex. Rex stood with his weight distributed evenly on all 4 feet, his posture satisfied in the particular way of an animal that has done the thing it was designed to do and understands the results. "That was the pump," Garrett said. "If we'd lost the pump, we'd have lost the system." Rex looked at him. "Good catch," Garrett said. Rex wagged once and went back to work. They continued along the line moving south, and it was there in the area of the unfinished system, the 40-acre section, that had no water access, that Rex stopped again. This time differently. He came off his regular inspection pace and dropped his nose close to the ground and began moving in a circle, tightening the circle with each pass, the behavior that meant he was tracking something concentrated in a specific location. He stopped above a section of bare ground near the unfinished terminus of the West Irrigation Branch. He pawed at it. Garrett crouched beside him. The ground here was softer than the surrounding soil, even after the storm, subtly, barely perceptibly, so but different in texture and color, the kind of difference that a working dog's nose registers long before a person's eye does. Garrett pressed his palm flat against the surface. Beneath the cold-packed exterior, the ground had a slight give to it. He got a shovel from the barn. 8 inches down, the shovel struck metal. A pipe, 2 inches in diameter, running in the direction of the south terminal fields. He cleared 18 inches in each direction and confirmed that it was continuous, not a fragment, not an abandoned section, but a complete buried run of irrigation pipe that had been laid underground and never connected to the surface system. He sat back on his heels. He looked at the diagram Briggs had given him. The buried line was not on the diagram. Raymond Holt had laid it separately earlier, before the diagram had been drawn, a preliminary run of foundation for the system he had been planning to build outward from, and then the diagram had been created to map the later work, and the buried section had simply not been included because it was already in the ground, and Raymond had known it was there. Without this line, completing the irrigation to the south fields would have required digging new trenches and laying new pipe across nearly 300 feet of ground, expensive, time-consuming, possibly beyond what Garrett could manage alone in a reasonable time frame. With this line already in place, the connection could be made from the surface system with a relatively short run of new pipe and a junction fitting. Garrett put his hand on the buried pipe. "You already did the hard part," he said quietly. The wind moved across the open ground around him. Rex sat beside the hole and watched the sky. The journal was in the desk. Garrett had been through most of the farmhouse in the 2 weeks since arriving, working through each room, methodically not looking for anything in particular, just building his understanding of what the property contained and what it needed. The study on the second floor was the last room he came to. Small and close-smelling of old paper and cedar, its shelves filled with seed catalogs and weather records going back nearly a decade, and 3 different editions of the same soil science textbook, each edition marked throughout with penciled notations in Raymond's careful hand. The journal was at the back of the desk drawer, leather-covered, thick, worn at the edges and corners. Garrett opened it. The entries began 6 years before. The early pages were primarily technical soil pH readings for different sections of the property, notes on irrigation flow rates and pressure loss calculations, sketches of crop rotation sequences mapped across the property's various fields. Raymond had written with the precision of a trained engineer. The observations were specific, numerical, anchored in data. But between the technical entries, other things appeared. Observations about the land that were not numerical. Notes about light at certain hours of certain days. Passages about the relationship between surface conditions and what lay beneath them, written in a voice that was simultaneously practical and occasionally something more than practical, the voice of a man who had thought seriously about his work and arrived at conclusions that went beyond the merely agricultural. The land does not particularly care what you intend. It responds to what you do. A man can have the best plan in the county and the worst harvest if he doesn't follow through. A man with a mediocre plan who shows up every day and pays attention will beat the planner almost every time. Garrett read slowly, sitting in the wooden chair at the desk with the afternoon light coming through the single window and Rex asleep on the floor near his feet. He turned pages. The tone of the entries shifted as they moved forward in time. In the earlier years, the journal was almost entirely forward-looking. The plans for the irrigation expansion, the vision for what the South fields could produce, projections about regional food supply, and the particular value of farms that operated outside the large corporate distribution networks. The towns in this part of the state used to feed themselves from within 50 miles. Now they bring grain in from 1,000 miles away because the local operations sold to the consolidators. The consolidators aren't wrong exactly, they're responding to incentives. But what gets lost is resilience. A town that can feed itself is a town that can withstand almost anything else. In the later entries, the plans remained, but the entries grew shorter. The handwriting changed, still deliberate, still legible, but slower, with occasional words corrected in a way that suggested the first attempt had not come out as intended. And then approximately halfway through the journal, Garrett found the page. It was not marked in any way. It did not announce itself as different from the pages on either side of it, but it was different in a way that he understood before he had finished the first sentence. There is a photograph I have kept on my desk for several years now. It is a military record photograph, the kind that appear in official documents. I obtained a copy through a researcher who locates that kind of information for people who have cause to look for it. I have looked at it many times. He was younger in the photograph than I imagine him now. 30 perhaps. The same serious face. The same kind of eyes. James had that kind of eyes. James did not come home. Garrett's hand went still on the page. I do not know why certain men come home and others do not. I have thought about this for many years, and I have not arrived at a satisfying answer. What I know is that the man in this photograph made a choice on a road in Syria when the easier choice was available to him. He did not take the easier choice. That is the only credential I require. He would be about James's age now. Not exactly. Close enough. The land needs someone who understands that some things are worth the cost of doing them properly. I believe he is that kind of man. I have believed it for 7 years. I am not revising my position. Garrett set the journal on the desk. He did not close it. He simply set it flat with the open page facing up and looked at the window for a long time. Outside, the Kansas winter light lay pale and even across the empty fields. The wind moved through the fence lines with a low sound that had already become familiar to him. Not comforting, not uncomfortable, just the constant voice of this landscape doing what it always did. Rex stirred. He got up from the floor and walked to Garrett's chair and put his head on Garrett's knee. The warmth of the dog's broad skull was immediate and solid through the fabric of his jeans. Garrett put his hand on Rex's head. He thought about a man he had never really met who had spent 7 years keeping a photograph in a desk drawer. He thought about a son whose name was James, who had known how to not leave people behind and who had not come home. He thought about a piece of ground left to someone who was almost but not quite a stranger. Then he thought about the tax notice in the kitchen drawer and the tractor with the dead battery and the patch on the barn roof that needed to be replaced properly before the next storm, and the 40 acres of South Field waiting for water that could now reach them through a buried pipe that a dog had found in the rain. He thought about 62 days. He thought about all the work there was to do. A man who saves strangers in war knows something about keeping promises. He closed the journal carefully and set it back on the desk. He did not put it back in the drawer. 3 days before the tax payment came due, Jack Briggs drove up the county road in the blue pickup and parked near the barn. He got out carrying a thermos and 2 cups, which he set on the tailgate of his truck, and he poured coffee into both of them without asking, and he handed one to Garrett and looked out across the south fields for a while without speaking. The buried pipe had been connected to the surface system. The junction fitting was new properly, seated, sealed with good tape, in a stainless clamp. Garrett had spent 3 days learning the pressure system well enough to test it, and on the morning he opened the valve, water had moved through the line and reached the south terminal for the first time since Raymond Holt had run out of time. He had not celebrated. He had stood at the terminal fitting and watched the water come out and felt something that was quieter than satisfaction, but more permanent. Southfield's got water, Briggs said. It was not a question. Since Tuesday, Garrett said. Briggs drank his coffee, looked at the field. Tax notice, he said. Garrett looked at him. Briggs reached into his jacket pocket and produced a folded check. He held it out without drama, without ceremony, in the flat, straightforward way that he did most things. Garrett did not take it immediately. It's a loan, Briggs said. Not a gift. You paid it back after first harvest with grain. 1 bale of whatever comes off that south field when it comes in. He paused. I want it in writing. There's a notepad in the truck. Garrett looked at the check. He looked at Briggs. Wi-Fi, he said. Briggs was quiet for a moment. Raymond called me 2 months before he died, he said. Asked me to keep an eye on the place after he was gone. Said he had arranged for someone to take it on and that the person might need some time to find their footing and that he would appreciate it if I didn't make that harder than it needed to be. He took another drink of his coffee. I told him I'd made an offer on the land and wasn't sure I was the right person to ask. He paused. He told me I was exactly the right person to ask because I understood what the land was worth, and I'd know if the new owner was wasting it. Garrett said nothing. You're not wasting it, Briggs said. Southfield has water. Barn roof is patched. You're still here. He looked at Garrett directly. Raymond didn't make mistakes about people. I've known him long enough to know that. So, he shook the check slightly. Loan, 1 bale, written agreement, no handshake nonsense. Garrett took the check. He looked at it. Thank you, he said. Write it down, Briggs said, already reaching into the truck cab for the notepad. They stood at the tailgate in the cold Kansas afternoon and wrote it out, a simple agreement, 1 sentence, both of them signing it, and Briggs folded his copy and put it in his shirt pocket and finished his coffee and got back into the truck. Before he closed the door, he looked at Rex, who had been sitting near the rear tire the entire time watching the exchange with his characteristic serious attention. Smart dog, Briggs said. Smarter than me, Garrett said. Briggs almost smiled. He drove away down the county road, the blue truck raising a thin line of dust in the winter air. Garrett stood where he was and watched it go. Rex came and sat beside him. The south field lay quiet in the afternoon light, 40 acres of dark, dry soil that had water moving beneath it, now for the first time and longer than it should have gone without. In the spring, when the ground warmed and the last frost passed, something could be planted there. Something could grow. It was not certain. Nothing about any of this was certain. But 62 days had come and gone, and Garrett Cole was still here standing on his own ground, with a dog beside him, and alone in his pocket, and a buried pipe that had been waiting for someone to find it. He looked at the envelope he had finally opened that morning, the one Raymond had left marked later, the one he had not been ready to read until now. A single index card inside the handwriting, the most unsteady he had seen from Raymond, which told him it had been written near the very end. 4 words: don't sell the Southfield. Garrett put the card back in his jacket pocket. He looked at the field. I won't, he said. The first spring came the way spring comes to the Kansas plain, not all at once, but in increments. The way a man wakes from a very deep sleep, slowly, and in stages each day, a little more light than the one before it. The ground warming by degrees that could not be seen but could be felt when you pressed your palm against the soil in the early morning and compared it to the morning before. Garrett had been pressing his palm against the soil every morning since February. He had read about this in one of Raymond's textbooks, the practice of monitoring ground temperature with your hand in the absence of a thermometer, learning to feel the difference between soil that was still locked in winter, cold, and soil that had begun its annual return towards something alive. Raymond had noted in the margin next to that passage in pencil, thermometers are fine, your hand is better. The thermometer tells you a number. Your hand tells you whether it's time. Garrett had bought a thermometer anyway, but he also used his hand. The planting window for winter wheat in western Kansas opened in late September and closed in early November. He had learned that from the seed catalogs in Raymond's study, confirmed it with Briggs over the fence line on a cold January afternoon when the older man had been characteristically direct about the fact that Garrett had missed the window entirely for his first season and would need to plan for spring crops instead. Not a failure, a fact, an adjustment. Spring crops meant different calculations. The south field, newly connected to the irrigation system, was the priority. The soil there was what Raymond's notes had described it as dark, deep, well-structured, the kind of ground that repaid proper treatment with serious yields. Garrett had spent the winter learning what proper treatment looked like for this particular piece of earth, reading Raymond's journals and textbooks and asking Briggs questions that the older farmer answered with the economy of a man who did not see any reason to pad a useful answer with unnecessary words. The soybeans went in during the first week of May. Garrett drove the repaired grain drill in long, even passes across the south field, while Rex walked the perimeter patrolling the fence line, the way he had always patrolled the perimeter of any position methodically without distraction, monitoring for anything that did not belong. The tractor had been running since March, when Garrett had finally admitted to himself that he could not fix the fuel system alone and had called a mechanic from the nearest town, a laconic man named Dwight who had taken the engine apart over 2 days, identified a partially collapsed fuel line and a clogged injector, repaired both, charged a fair price, and told Garrett the machine would run another 10 years if he maintained it properly. Garrett had written down everything Dwight told him about maintenance. He wrote most things down now. Notes in a notebook he kept in the kitchen, following Raymond's practice, though not Raymond's format, his own system built from his own observations, accumulating in the same way that competence accumulates entry by entry, day by day. The soybean rows went in straight. He had not expected that to matter to him as much as it did the straightness of the rows, the visual proof that the machine had been guided correctly and the seeds placed where they were intended to be placed. But standing at the south end of the field, when the planting was finished, and looking back along the length of it, seeing the even parallel furrows stretching away toward the north end of the property, he felt something that he identified after a moment as pride. Not loud pride, the quiet kind, the kind that does not need an audience. Rex walked up beside him and sat. Together they looked at the planted field. "You're fine," Garrett said. "You know that." Rex tilted his head slightly. "That pipe. You found it. Without it, none of this works." He scratched the dog behind his left ear. "Don't let it go to your head." Rex turned and began walking back toward the barn with the air of an animal who has accepted a compliment gracefully and moved on. Summer came in hard. The Kansas summer was not the cold that which kills of Montana winter. It was a different kind of demanding, the kind that bleaches the sky white by 10 in the morning and holds the temperature above 90 until past 7 in the evening and draws the moisture out of everything that does not have deep enough roots or a reliable enough water source to resist it. The irrigation system held. Garrett monitored it every morning, walking the lines before the heat became prohibitive, checking the fittings and the pressure and the output at the terminal points. Raymond's underground pipe delivered water to the Southfield's drip lines on a schedule Garrett had calculated from the soil moisture readings he took every 3 days at 6 points distributed across the field. The soybeans grew in the heat, the way soybeans grow when they have what they need. Steadily, methodically green and dense, the rows thickening through June and into July until the field had become a solid mass of vegetation that moved in the wind like something breathing. The wheat in the north and east fields came in during July. Garrett hired 2 men from town for the harvest day labor. Nothing permanent arranged through a board at the feed store in Ashford that served as an informal labor exchange for the farms in the surrounding area. The men knew their work. They did not need to be told how to operate the combine, which was fortunate because Garrett had only recently learned it himself and would not have been the most authoritative instructor. He drove one pass with each of them, watching confirm that the machine was calibrated correctly for the crop density, and then stood at the field edge with Rex while the harvest moved across the north field in long, steady passes. The yield was not exceptional, but it was real. It was his Raymond's and now his. And when Marcus Ford drove out from Ashford on the second day of harvest in a white pickup truck with the name of his storage and distribution operation stenciled on the door, Garrett shook the man's hand and showed him the grain and watched Ford walk the rows with the careful attention of someone who was deciding whether what he was seeing was worth his sustained interest. Ford was in his late 40s, lean and long-limbed, with the deliberate movements of a man who had learned not to make quick decisions about things that mattered. He had studied agriculture in college and then returned to Ashford to run the family warehousing operation that his father had built over 30 years. He had known Raymond Holt, not closely but well enough to understand what the old man had been trying to build with the farm's expanded operation. He walked the north field in its harvested state, looking at the stubble, looking at the soil condition, taking a handful of earth and working it between his fingers. "North field's been well managed," he said. "This is healthy soil." "That was Raymond," Garrett said, "not me." "The irrigation line reaching the south section," Ford said. "That's recent. Winter project." Ford looked at him. "Raymond couldn't get that done in 3 years. You got it done in 1 winter." "I had help," Garrett said. Ford looked at Rex, who was sitting near the truck. "The dog helped you run irrigation pipe." "More than you'd think," Garrett said. Ford almost smiled. He looked back at the field. "I'll take the wheat. Standard terms, 30 days to payment. If the soybeans come in the way that field looks, I'd like to talk about a longer arrangement." "What kind of arrangement?" Garrett said. "There are 3 small towns within 40 miles of this farm that import grain from distribution networks 600 miles away," Ford said. "Raymond wanted to change that. He talked to me about it a number of times." He paused. "I think it can be done. The infrastructure exists. What's been missing is a reliable local supplier with the right acreage and the right water access." He looked at the south field. "That may have changed." Garrett thought about an entry in Raymond's journal. The towns in this part of the state used to feed themselves from within 50 miles. "Let's see what the soybeans do," Garrett said. "Fair enough," Ford said. They shook hands at the truck. Rex watched Ford drive away down the county road, then looked at Garrett. "1 step at a time," Garrett said. Rex appeared to find this acceptable. The soybeans came in during September, in the particular quality of autumn light that turns everything in the Kansas plains gold and amber, and makes even ordinary things look like they have been illuminated from within. Garrett drove the harvest with Briggs walking the perimeter. The older man had appeared on the first morning of the soybean harvest, without announcement as he appeared for most things, and had positioned himself at the south end of the field in a way that made clear he intended to be there for the duration, without making any particular statement about it. When the last pass was finished and the combine was quiet and the south field lay flat and harvested in the afternoon sun, Briggs walked out to the middle of it and stood there for a moment with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the stubble and the dark work soil. Garrett walked out to where he stood. They stood together in the middle of Raymond Holt's south field without speaking for a while. "Good yield," Briggs said eventually. "Better than I expected," Garrett said. "Raymond always said this was the best ground on the property." Briggs looked at the soil under his boot. He was right. Garrett did not say anything. Briggs reached into his shirt pocket and produced a folded piece of paper, the loan agreement they had written on the tailgate of his truck the previous winter, both signatures at the bottom. He held it out to Garrett. Garrett took it. "We said 1 bale," Garrett said. "We said 1 bale," Briggs agreed. "I'd like to make it 2. Briggs looked at him. "You got me through the first winter," Garrett said. 2 bales. Briggs considered this for a moment with the expression of a man weighing an argument policy he does not intend to accept. 1 bale, he said. "That was the agreement." "The agreement was the minimum," Garrett said. A pause. 1 bale, Briggs said, "and you can buy me coffee sometime." "Done," Garrett said. Briggs took the loan agreement back from Garrett's hand, folded it once more, and put it in his pocket. He looked across the harvested field toward the house and the barn and the long line of the irrigation system running back toward the pump house. Then, without turning his head, he said, "Raymond picked right." The words landed in the quiet of the harvested field and stayed there. Garrett did not respond immediately. He stood with the autumn light across his shoulders and the smell of cut soybeans in the cold air and the sound of Rex moving somewhere along the south fence line, and he let the words be what they were. "Thank you," he said, "for the loan, for walking me through the system, for showing up." Briggs gave a single brief nod. "That fence on the south boundary still needs a post," he said. "Saturday," Garrett said. "Saturday," Briggs agreed. He walked back to his truck. Rex turned 8 in October. There was no ceremony, no particular acknowledgement. The day passed the way most days passed on the farm, with work in the morning, inspection in the afternoon, and a long, quiet evening on the porch when the day's labor was done. But Garrett had noticed across the summer and into the fall the small changes that the years had begun to make in the bond who had been beside him for the last 4 of the hardest ones. The pace had slowed, not dramatically. Rex still covered the property, and every morning still ran the fence line when something in the wind warranted it, still positioned himself with the alert precision of a working animal during any activity that might require his attention. But the morning circuit took longer now. The runs were shorter. After a full day's work, Rex did not recover with the effortless speed he had brought to everything in his younger years. He slept more deeply, moved more carefully, getting up from a resting position, took the porch steps one at a time in the evenings instead of in a single bound. His muzzle had gone gray around the edges. The gray was spreading. Garrett watched this the way you watch something you cannot stop, and have made your peace with watching steadily without looking away, registering every change because every change deserved to be seen. He had increased Rex's food ration in September. He had started adding a joint supplement to the morning meal prescribed by the veterinarian in Ashford, who had examined Rex during the summer and pronounced him fundamentally healthy, but working through the inevitable arithmetic of age. He had moved Rex's sleeping position from the floor of the bedroom to a low platform he built from cedar boards and lined with a dense foam pad that the feed store happened to carry, positioned near the base of the bedroom wall where the drafts did not reach. Rex had investigated the platform with characteristic thoroughness and then stepped onto it and lay down and looked at Garrett with an expression that communicated acceptance without enthusiasm. "You're welcome," Garrett said. Rex put his head on his paws. On the morning of what Garrett had determined from the adoption paperwork to be Rex's 8th birthday, the dog was already awake when Garrett came downstairs sitting in the kitchen in the early dark, his amber eyes reflecting the single lamp Garrett switched on over the stove. Garrett made coffee. He poured a second cup and then set it back on the counter because Rex did not drink coffee, which was the kind of thing a person thinks in the early morning on the farm before the day has fully assembled itself. He sat down on the floor of the kitchen, back against the cabinet beneath the sink. Rex walked over and lay down beside him, his large body heavy against Garrett's leg, his breathing slow and even. They sat like that for a while in the kitchen in the dark, the coffee going slightly cold in the cup on the counter, the farm outside beginning its barely perceptible shift from night to pre-dawn. 8 years, Garrett said. Rex breathed. You were 3 when they paired you with me. He put his hand on the dog's back, feeling the rise and fall of his ribs. I was in pretty bad shape. Rex moved his tail once against the floor. You knew that? You always knew that? Garrett looked at the ceiling. I don't know what I would have done those first 2 years. Not a theory, a real question. He paused. I don't want to know the answer. Rex shifted slightly, pressing more of his weight against Garrett's leg. You found the pipe, Garrett said. You found the valve fitting in the rain. You told me when something was wrong before I could see it. He scratched behind Rex's ear in the specific place the dog had always leaned into since the first week Garrett had known him. Still don't know how you do that. Rex closed his eyes. More mornings than I want to count, Garrett said quietly. You were the reason I got up. The kitchen was very still. Outside, the first gray of dawn was beginning at the edges of the horizon, the flat Kansas sky lightening in its slow daily increments. Somewhere across the south field, something moved a deer, probably, or one of the coyotes that worked the fence lines after harvest season, and Rex's ears moved toward the sound, without the rest of him following, registering, and assessing and determining in the way he determined everything that it did not require action. Garrett felt that subtle shift in the ears against his hand and recognized it as a thing it had always been. I am still working, even here. Even now, I have not stopped. I know, Garrett said. Neither have I. He found the envelope in November. He had been through the study many times over the past year. He knew its contents the way he knew the property's irrigation diagram, not perfectly, but well enough to navigate it reliably. But the desk itself he had never fully dismantled. He had opened the drawers, removed what was immediately relevant, and left the rest in place out of a respect for Raymond's organization that he could not entirely explain except to say that it felt wrong to clear a space before he understood what he was clearing. On a cold November afternoon with the first real frost of the season on the ground outside and Rex asleep on his platform downstairs, Garrett sat at the desk in the study and began going through the remaining contents of the bottom drawer. Seed catalogs, a manual for an irrigation pump model that predated the current system by 2 generations, a folded county survey map with Raymond's annotations in the margins, a small stack of Christmas cards rubber-banded from people whose names Garrett did not recognize, neighbors presumably and colleagues from Raymond's engineering years, people who had continued sending cards long after the connection that prompted the habit had faded. At the back of the drawer, tucked into the far corner, where the drawer's back panel met its base, was a wooden box, small, perhaps 6 inches by 4. Cedar, the same cedar that had scented this room since the first morning Garrett walked into it. The lid fit tightly and required some pressure to open the wood, having swollen slightly with years of humidity cycles. Inside was a single item, a photograph. Black and white, slightly faded, the kind of photograph taken by a military photographer. With a medium format camera formal, posed the subject sitting upright in dress uniform, hands resting on his thighs, his expression composed with the specific kind of seriousness that young men adopt when they understand they are being recorded for a document that will outlast the moment. He was young, mid-20s at most. The uniform was Marine Corps dress blues. His face was broad and open with a jaw that recalled Raymond's jaw in the photographs along the downstairs hall, and eyes that looked at the camera with the clear, direct steadiness of someone who had not yet had reason to look at anything sideways. Garrett turned the photograph over. On the back in Raymond's handwriting, the later handwriting, the unsteady kind, written when the steadiness had become difficult, but the deliberateness had not diminished. He would have been about your age now. Garrett sat very still. The study was quiet around him. The afternoon light through the single window was pale and level, the winter sun too low to cast shadows at this hour, filling the room instead with a flat, even illumination that showed everything clearly and softened nothing. He looked at the photograph for a long time. James Holt had Raymond's build, the breadth through the chest, the thickness of the forearms visible even beneath the dress uniform sleeves. He had Raymond's jaw. He did not look afraid of anything. He looked like a young man who had decided clearly and without reservation what he was going to be, and who had arranged himself in front of that camera with the complete confidence of someone whose decision was made and would not be revisited. Garrett thought about the entry in the journal. He was a soldier too. He didn't come home. He thought about a man sitting in this room, in this chair, at this desk, looking at this photograph for years after the fact of it, the fact of the absence, the permanent arithmetic of a son who left and did not return, which is a thing that does not resolve and does not diminish and does not become easier to carry, but simply becomes the weight that a person learns to distribute across the days so that the days remain possible. He thought about an old man on a road in Syria, standing over an injured man he was not willing to leave in a moment, when the easier choice was entirely available to him, and he had not taken it, and the words Raymond had written in the journal came back to him with a clarity they had not carried when he first read them. He didn't leave a single man behind either. Rex appeared in the doorway. He had come upstairs without Garrett hearing him. The cedar platform must have released him quietly, and he stood in the doorway of the study now with his amber eyes tracking Garrett's face, reading whatever his face was carrying, making his determination. He walked across the room. He put his head on Garrett's knee. The weight of the dog's skull against his leg was the same weight it had always been, solid and warm and real, and completely present, the weight of an animal that has chosen a person and does not revise that choice based on circumstances. Garrett put his hand on Rex's head. He did not say anything. There are moments that do not need speech, and this was one of them. A man in a chair in a cold room in November, holding a photograph of someone he had never met, who might have been sitting in this chair if the world had arranged itself differently, with a dog beside him who had found a buried pipe in the rain and stood in every doorway and walked every fence line and been the reason on more mornings than Garrett could count that the day had been possible at all. He sat with it. All of it. For a long time, he simply sat with it. He built a sign in December. He built it the way he built most things on the farm, carefully, without rushing, taking the time required to do it correctly. He found the wood in the barn, a section of thick-cut cedar board that Raymond had stored in the dry section near the back wall, properly seasoned, clear-grained, the kind of wood that takes a chisel cleanly without splitting. He borrowed the letter-cutting tools from Briggs, who produced them from a workshop shelf, with the expression of a man who has kept equipment in good order, precisely because good equipment kept in good order is always eventually useful. He worked on it in the evenings. An hour at a time, by lamplight at the workbench he had cleared in the corner of the barn closest to the house. Rex lay on a folded blanket near the bench and watched the work the way he watched all work, with the patient, thorough attention of an animal for whom observation was not passive, but active, a form of participation. The letters took shape slowly. He was not a craftsman. He had no particular background in woodworking or sign-making, but he had spent 14 years doing things that required care and precision in conditions that did not forgive carelessness. And he brought that same quality of attention to the letters he was cutting into the cedar board, measuring each one, checking the spacing, running his thumb along the edges to confirm that the cuts were clean. When it was finished, he stood it upright on the workbench and looked at it. The letters were not perfect. They were even and legible and carefully made, but they had the slight imperfections of hand-cut work. Minor variations in depth, the occasional slight lean to a vertical stroke that made them look like what they were, which was the work of a person who had taken his time and paid attention and cared about what he was making. James and Raymond Holt Farm. He looked at it for a long time. He had thought about this for weeks, about what to name the place, about whether to name it at all or simply let the land be what the land was without requiring language to define it, about whether putting his own name on it would be the right thing or the wrong thing or simply beside the point. He had decided that it was beside the point. He was the person who was here now. He was the person doing the work and keeping the promises and pressing his palm against the soil in the early morning to feel whether the ground was ready. But the land had a history that preceded him, a history of two men, a father and a son who had each given something they could not get back, and who deserved to be remembered by the ground they had cared about and the ground that had, in its particular way, cared about them. His name would be on the deed. Their names would be on the gate. That felt right to him. It felt like the kind of rightness that does not require explanation to anyone who understands what they are looking at. The morning he put the sign up, Briggs drove over. He had not been called. He simply appeared the blue pickup, turning off the county road at the usual time, as if the morning was an ordinary morning, and he had simply come by for coffee and fence conversation. He got out and walked toward the gate where Garrett was setting the post, and he stopped when he saw the sign and stood looking at it. Garrett continued working. He leveled the post, tamped the ground around it, attached the sign to the cross brace with the hardware he had sourced from the farm supply in Ashford. When it was done, he stepped back. Briggs stood beside him. They looked at the sign on the gate at the entry to the county road, the cedar letters reading clear and even in the winter morning light. James and Raymond Holt Farm. Briggs was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Raymond would have appreciated that." "I hope so," Garrett said. "He would have," Briggs said. He said it with the flat, undecorated certainty of a man who had known Raymond Holt for 30 years and was not in the habit of saying things he did not mean. They walked back to the house. Garrett made coffee. They drank it at the kitchen table without saying very much, looking out the window at the winter fields, gray and brown and still in the cold morning, carrying their dormant seeds in the frozen ground, waiting with the patient indifference of earth for the turn of the season that always came. He sat on the porch that evening. The temperature was dropping with the early dark. He way December evenings drop in western Kansas quickly and without negotiation, the cold moving in across the open land, the moment the sun cleared the horizon and took its warmth with it. He had put on his jacket and pulled it close and settled into Raymond's rocking chair, the left one, which had always felt like Raymond's, though he could not have said why, some quality in its worn finish, or the way it sat slightly lower than the right, and he let the chair find its natural movement. Rex lay on the porch boards at his feet. The dog was on his side now, his breathing slow and deep, his great body relaxed in the specific way it relaxed only in the evenings when the day's work was done and the perimeter had been checked, and everything that required watching had been watched and found to be, for the moment, all right. His muzzle was gray. His coat was still thick, still warm, still the beautiful black and tan that had not changed with the years, even as everything else about him had begun to slow and settle. His amber eyes were closed. His breathing moved his ribs in a steady, even rhythm. Garrett looked at him. Then he looked out at the fields. The south field was empty, now harvested, and turned over for winter, its dark soil sitting open to the cold sky. But in his mind, he could still see the soybeans the way they had looked in August, dense and green, moving in the summer wind, the product of water that a buried pipe had carried to ground that had been waiting for it. He could see the wheat harvest in July. He could see Marcus Ford walking the field with his careful, assessing eye. He could hear the grain going into the storage bins with the sound that grain makes, the sound of something substantial being properly gathered. He thought about 3 towns within 40 miles. He thought about a spring planting season that was 4 months away with better knowledge now than he'd had a year ago, with a working system and tested soil, and a neighbor who knew the land and would show up on Saturday mornings without being asked. He thought about an 8-year-old German shepherd asleep at his feet who had found a buried pipe in a rainstorm and changed the arithmetic of everything that followed. He thought about a cedar sign on a gate at the end of the county road. He thought about a man he had met for 4 minutes on a road in Syria who had kept a photograph in a desk drawer for 7 years and written him a letter and left him a piece of ground. And he thought about the letter Arthur Wells had handed him in a Kansas City office that had smelled of carpeting and restrained professional calm, and the single sentence in Raymond Holt's careful hand that had been the axis on which the past year had turned. I had plans for it that I did not finish. I am trusting you to finish them. He was not finished. There was a full winter between now and the next planting season, and work to do in the winter, and a spring after that, and a harvest after that, and all the seasons that followed in their turn with their particular demands and their particular gifts, the whole slow, demanding, honest cycle of working ground. That was good ground. If you treated it as good ground, deserved to be treated. He was not finished, but he was here. He was still here. He reached down and put his hand on Rex's side, feeling the rise and fall of the dog's breathing, the warmth of him against the cold evening air. Rex stirred slightly at the touch, not waking, just registering. I know you're there, and settled more deeply into the boards of the porch. Garrett rested his arm on the rocking chair and looked out across the darkening fields. Somewhere across the county road, in the space between the last light and the first stars, a single hawk was riding the last thermal of the day, circling wide and unhurried against the deep blue of the winter evening sky. He watched it until it moved beyond the tree line at the property's north edge and disappeared. The rocking chair moved slowly. The fields lay quiet. The sign at the gate at the end of the road held the names of 2 men who had understood what it meant to not walk away from something that needed staying, with a son who had not come home from a war, and a father who had spent the years after building something worth staying for and leaving it to a soldier he had met once on a road in the smoke and noise of a terrible day, because that soldier had shown him in 4 minutes the only credential that had ever mattered to Raymond Holt. He had not left anyone behind. Garrett Cole sat in the rocking chair on the porch of the farmhouse in the winter evening, with his hand on his dog and his fields in front of him, and the names of 2 men on his gate. And for the first time in longer than he could accurately calculate, longer than Montana, longer than the parking lot, longer than the applications that went unanswered in the mornings that started with $36 and no clear reason to move, he was not scanning the horizon. He was not watching for what might come. He was simply here, on his ground, home. Some men spend their whole lives looking for a place to belong. Garrett Cole drove 1,400 miles to find his on land, left by a man he barely knew, carrying the memory of a son he never met, with a dog walking beside him, who had found the buried pipe that made the whole thing possible. He had spent 14 years learning not to leave people behind. As it turned out, that was exactly the kind of man the land had been waiting for. Sometimes that's how home works. Not given, not stumbled into, kept.